Hello Gardena Cinema. Welcome to this screening of King Kong vs. Godzilla. My name is Patrick Galvan. I'm a film journalist specializing in Japanese cinema, including the Japanese special effects films made by Toho Studios. Before the film begins, I want to talk to you a little bit about the film's making, how it came about, the intention of the filmmakers, and how this film, which began as a very witty satire on Japanese commercialism, was re-edited into a straightforward monster match that we're going to watch today. The genesis for King Kong vs. Godzilla actually traces back to America, and a filmmaker named Willis O'Brien. O'Brien was the very innovative technician behind the groundbreaking special effects on the original King Kong movie. In 1960, O'Brien was shopping around a treatment called King Kong Meets Frankenstein, in which the giant ape fought an oversized Frankenstein's monster. The project was renamed King Kong vs. the Ginkgo, and eventually King Kong vs. Prometheus, but failed to find a backer in Hollywood. O'Brien eventually entrusted his project to a man named John Beck, who also failed to find a backer in Hollywood, but eventually found interest in Toho Studios in Japan. A deal was struck, and the film was greenlit. However, there'd be a big change. The enemy monster would be changed from a vague humanoid creature to Toho's own character, Godzilla. As is pretty well known, the original Godzilla film was made in 1954 in Japan, and director Ishiro Honda envisioned a very serious movie when he made it. Honda basically used the framework of a monster movie to comment on contemporary Japanese issues, namely the consequences of war and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. When Godzilla became a smash hit, Honda was quite logically attached to other science fiction pictures like The Mysterians and Battle in Outer Space, which also used science fiction to comment on contemporary issues. Honda was attached to direct King Kong vs. Godzilla, and once again, science fiction would be used to comment on a serious topic. However, the approach this time would be somewhat different. Honda and his screenwriter, Shinichi Sekizawa, combined the monster movie with a salaryman comedy, and the target this time was rampant commercialization, namely in the TV industry. Television was a fairly new commodity in Japan at the time. It had first arrived in the land of the rising sun in 1953, so about 10 years earlier. Initially, television was a commodity for the rich. It was very expensive. Even the smallest, cheapest set cost about as much as, believe it or not, a house with land. However, as time went on, and as Japan's economy changed and television sets became cheaper, more and more people bought TV and became subscribers. As a result, the number of sets in Japan, which began as less than 1,000, became 12 million by 1962 when King Kong vs. Godzilla was made. And with this, rampant spread of commercialism and television ratings came an intense ratings war racket. Japanese TV executives found that the way to attract eyeballs was not through serious entertainment, but through things like wrestling matches and stunt programs. Shows that, for example, focused on bad singers, shows that focused upon stunts like, on-camera food fights, and programs like the aptly named Let's Do Anything show. Shows like these tend to be very, very popular, and it prompted the social critic Soichi Oya to decry, "Is Japan turning into a nation of 100 million idiots?" Honda and Sekizawa were very aware of this phenomenon, and they skewered this in King Kong vs. Godzilla through the story. In the film, a brash TV executive is dismayed by the low ratings for his program, and so he devises a very bonkers scenario. Let's go to King Kong's island, kidnap him, bring him to Japan, and use him as our company's mascot to sell our products. Meantime, Godzilla awakens, goes on a rampage, and consequently steals all the attention and headlines away from King Kong. That prompts the executive to go even further. Let's have the monsters fight each other for the ultimate ratings war. So as you can see, very outlandish, very comical, but not too far removed from the very bonkers, insane ratings racket that was actually happening in Japan at the time. King Kong vs. Godzilla was one of the films that was being used to celebrate Toho's 30th anniversary, and it was a huge sensational hit in Japan. The film sold 11.2 million tickets on its first release, and to this day remains the most popular and highly attended Japanese Godzilla film in history. Of course, that's not exactly the film we're watching today. As I mentioned before, this project was brought to Toho by a man named John Beck, who also had the rights to show the film outside of Asia. New scenes were shot with American actors, some of the satire was watered down, and much of Akira Ifukube's brilliant score was replaced with stock music. The overall impression is still the same. The film is still quite clearly a comedy. Despite John Beck's attempt to westernize the story, one can still see in the narrative the very ridiculous nature that began the project. However, contrary to what you might still hear now and then, there were not two endings for the film. Supposedly, Godzilla won in the Japanese version, and Kong won in the American version. The story actually began in an issue of a magazine called Spacemen in the 1960s. It was edited by Forrest J. Ackerman of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine fame. Alas, it's a very endearing story, but it's completely false. Both films have the exact same ending. Thank you for joining me. Now let's start the show. This is King Kong vs. Godzilla, directed by Ishiro Honda. Hello, Gardena Cinema. Welcome to the screening of King Kong Escapes. My name is Patrick Galvan. I'm a film journalist specializing in Japanese cinema, including the Japanese special effects cinema made by Toho Studios. Before the film begins, I want to talk to you a little bit about King Kong Escapes, how the film came about, and where it fits into the grand scheme of Japanese cinema. Japanese science fiction at this point had been going on for well over a decade, and the 1960s was what was known as the monster boom. And the year this film was made, 1967, is regarded as the peak of the monster boom, for good reason. All the major studios were making science fiction pictures this year. There was this film, Son of Godzilla, Gap of the Triphibian Monster, The X from Outer Space, The Magic Serpent, lots and lots of monster films for parents and their kids to see. King Kong vs. Godzilla had been made 5 years earlier, and was a huge sensational hit in Japan. And Toho was very eager to make more King Kong movies. A couple years afterwards, they approached Rankin Bass, the company behind the animated King Kong show. And they showed them a script titled Operation Robinson Crusoe, King Kong vs. Ebirah. The Americans were not very fond of that script, so they turned it down. And the project was repackaged as a Godzilla film, with no King Kong involved. That film became Jun Fukuda's delightful Godzilla vs. the Sea Monster. And then Toho set about with a new script titled King Kong Escapes. And this time, the project was greenlit. King Kong vs. Godzilla had been a very clever satire on Japanese commercialism. King Kong Escapes, by contrast, was more of a straightforward entertainment picture. Director Ishiro Honda and special effects director Eiji Tsuburaya were told repeatedly by the front office, make it suitable for children. Not too violent, not too bloody, not too gruesome, good for parents and their children. In the course of his science fiction career, Honda had worked with many accomplished American actors. Nick Adams had starred in Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, as well as Frankenstein vs. Baragon, and Russ Tamblyn of West Side Story fame had starred in none other than War of the Gargantuas. For this film, Honda got to work with Rhodes Reason, whom the American financiers also used as a kind of on-set quality assurance man. There were also some very noteworthy Japanese actors in the film as well, including Akira Takarada, the star of the original Godzilla film, the great character actor Hideo Yamamoto, and the wonderful actress Mie Hama, whom Bond fans will know for playing Kissy Suzuki in You Only Live Twice. And of course, you saw the introduction by Linda Miller, who plays the woman who sets Kong's heart aflame. The 5 years between King Kong vs. Godzilla and King Kong Escapes is a very interesting period in Japanese film history. As I mentioned before, King Kong vs. Godzilla was a film designed to skewer the TV ratings racket in Japan. And unfortunately, the thing that film was making fun of became all too popular and effective throughout the intervening years. Television was very rapidly becoming popular in Japan, the studios were downsizing, and Japan's film industry, once very empirical, was now a shell of its former self. And whereas King Kong vs. Godzilla had been a smash hit, King Kong Escapes was decidedly far less successful. It wasn't even one of the top 10 hits of its year. But of course, that has done nothing to deter the film's enduring cult film status, which is why we're all here today. And so, with no further ado, let's start the show. Here is King Kong Escapes, directed by Ishiro Honda.